Welcome back. Today we're here to discuss one of the kind of formatting concepts that through chapter 1 was developed and understood by a competitive scene and how that really altered the ending of chapter 1 metagame, and honestly how we believe that it may have even impacted the design of Rise of the Floodborn. So in today's video we're going to be covering what is the Rapunzel effect is what we're calling it, and how did Ravensburger actually adapt to this and kind of maybe take a shot at attempting of removing it. Let's get into the video. So today, Scott, we're talking about Rapunzel specifically, but there's other cards that also create this type of friction. So why
Yep.
don't we get into the actual Rapunzel effect, and why don't you tell me what that is?
So what I've deemed the Rapunzel problem is basically the need to interact with your opponent's board. So if you don't have any damage characters, Rapunzel's Gleam and Glow effect and removing damage and then drawing cards obviously doesn't come into play. So the reason why I use it for her is because she costs so much less than other characters that have similar issues like Aladdin Heroic Outlaw or Taka Heartless that we put on the screen now. So essentially, if your Rapunzel early in the game does not have anyone to remove damage from, she's not going to be able to draw you cards. So early in the metagame, when Rapunzel, well, I would say like midway through the metagame, when Rapunzel started seeing more and more play, what wound up happening was a lot of control players would have things like Rafiki in play, or even like a random other mid-range character in play, and what brought the prominence of of Amber Steel out was they could run their higher willpower characters into these other characters in play for seemingly no effect other than just having Rapunzel eventually heal that damage off and draw you a bunch of cards. So what wound up happening was the original player in this situation, we'll just call it like the Rafiki player, basically just either stop playing Rafiki type effects in general or wouldn't allow their characters to even be challenged. So what you wound up happening was a lot of characters just literally staring at each other ready across the table from one another. And there just wasn't as much interaction going on between between challenging smartly in this situation because of how powerful drawing multiple cards and leaving a 1/5 with 2 lore in play as a 4-cost uninkable was. It was the smart play to not have your 3 strength character be able to be challenged, for example, by like a 2/4 Tinkerbell, so Rapunzel could come in right on curve and draw you 3 cards. So what wound up happening a lot of times was Amber was able to play this like aggro control game that kept adding threats to the board while drawing multiple cards with almost little condition because the other player had to use their characters in order to either just gain some incremental lore as the game went on or remove your original characters from seeing play. And it was the situation of like, okay, so I have a Simba in bodyguard mode protecting my Lilo, for example. If they swing the Rafiki into it to seemingly get a 2-for-1, you're making that up by eventually swinging a 4 toughness, sorry, 4 willpower character into it, and then removing that damage. So the game became this like stall effect where everyone was kind of scared to challenge or even quest because of how powerful in this situation Rapunzel was. But you could make the same argument like for her Aladdin Heroic Outlaw a little later in the game as well. They didn't want to use their characters at all, especially when you had something like a pocket watch in play, because Aladdin would come in, challenge their guy, usually survive. So you're creating a 2-for-1 situation as it is, and you would have a 4 lore swing. The Aladdin player gains 2 and you lose 2. So a lot of times, like if a perceived threat was understood by the tournament player, which is the smart thing to do, the game would just stop all of a sudden. And it's what I just have deemed like the Rapunzel problem. And I've seen cards from Rise of the Floodborn that fall into the same trap.
Right. So key takeaways here are we call it the Rapunzel problem because we think the Rapunzel is like the greatest offender,
Sure.
which is why we're calling it the Rapunzel problem or the Rapunzel effect and things like that, just so everyone's clear on that. But in all honesty, its biggest for me is like, yes, the Rapunzel effect created like a ripple in the metagame. Like once it was clear that Amber Steel should be playing Rapunzels, and that you should have been buying Rapunzel's early, right? Because like
Right.
we remember very early on in the yeah, well that's a whole other debate, but we remember very early on, Anthony King won PPG Denver without Rapunzel's, and everyone was like, "Oh my god, we don't need Rapunzel's." Well, that wasn't true. He just didn't own Rapunzel's. Hell, he didn't even own 4 Tinkerbells, right? Like
Mhm.
it was 2 weeks after the game started, or after the chapter one was
Mhm.
out. There wasn't a lot of product available, and he just built what he had to play. It didn't mean by any which means that it was the best deck.
Mhm.
So the moment that players started adding Rapunzel, it created this effect of, well, now my matchup into Ruby Amethyst is flipped upside down in a little bit. But what ended up happening is that Ruby Amethyst adapted. So then they adapt it and they're like, okay, well, now I can deal with that. And then we go one step further. We start adding Carefree Surfers into our decks. And now Ruby Amethyst is just all in all sorts of trouble trying to answer too many things. But the other gigantic offender of all this is that the Aladdin, uh, in my opinion, is the worst offender because with Aladdin being what it is and how we gained lore in chapter one, it really had to be a cost efficient turn for you to be vulnerable to Aladdin. So a lot of times in those end games, once Ruby Amethyst got to 10, 11 lore, and they just even if they didn't have Pocket Watch in play, the moment they hit 11 lore or 11 ink, they had the capability of just all in one turn playing Pocket Watch, giving him rush, and then playing Aladdin and kind of just doing the 4 point swings.
Yep.
And most decks can't afford to take so many incremental 4 point swings. And then it got worse when it became the mirror. And this is the whole problem with it is that the mirror, you literally got to a point where it wasn't even worth it to quest until you had like 20 ink in play.
Mhm.
It's
Yep.
like you needed to have this like unbelievable turns to make up for your loss. And it's really crazy to see the game develop in that way. And I don't think per se, from like the designer in me, that it was realized that that's how the game would get. Like we've talked about this before. Like we don't think that Ruby Amethyst was ever designed to have like 12 items in it, right? Like
Right.
it doesn't feel that that's like a natural point or something that you would catch in like a small testing room. Um, but what is very clear to me is that as they started to develop, and now granted, what I believe to be true is that they probably, I think this has even been said, they developed the first 3 sets together. So because they had 3 sets together, they probably had like a 500, 600 card pool or something like that. And then once they decided on what chapter one was, then you get to the ground floor of deciding how to implement chapter two. And while I believe they didn't have this clear understanding of exactly what like the Ruby Amethyst deck is going to look like and how those mirror matches are going to play out, I think it's very clear that they understood that this thing could happen, that players wouldn't feel the necessary to move the game forward, or there wasn't enough ways to gain lore outside of just questing. And that's
Right.
why it was so limited in chapter one, but it feels like it's overextended into chapter two now because of all of these amounts of incremental cards. Um, so it was very interesting to see the game, set very early on of Ruby Amethyst just being so overly powerful when in the end Amber Steel showed that it was like without a doubt the most dominant deck in the game. And then through those curves of just understanding like every single point becomes, well, the game becomes about Rapunzel and it becomes about Aladdin. And there aren't really many cards that like truly give that. But even if you go to the extent of just Challenger or, in all honesty, Rush, like a couple weeks ago, when Nick won the 2K for Apex Gaming, like he said, like in his interview, like I just don't quest on turn two because of Rafiki. So like things like that, like once you start playing in that competitive upper echelon of players and understanding that you need to make these moves, well, that's all in the same genre of Rapunzel effect. It's all the same of like, I don't want to move the game forward because if I play into my opponent's role, then he gets to take advantage of his cards. And it's just like this never ending loop of not actually playing the game of Lorcana.
Right. Agreed.
So with that, what are some of the what were some of the ways that we did interact with it in chapter 1 that we haven't mentioned yet, right? So we have what we have on board here. So talk to me about what these cards did.
So I'll say that as I thought and looked through decks that have existed throughout the chapter 1 metagame, this is pretty much all you got.
There was freeze. The only other card
Right.
that's not on screen right now is freeze, and that card's unplayable.
Right. So the game started out with somewhat of an understanding that this is the situation that was going to exist. So you had certain characters, I know very early on before the game even existed, there were Rockstar decks that were out there, and the best answer to them was Elsa Snow Queen. So like Rockstar, for example, would purposely not quest, purposely not challenge, etc., and Elsa Snow Queen allowed you to use it. Well, she fell out of favor because she was slow and not always an answer. Then suddenly you went in a situation where you had pretty much Elsa Spirit of Winter was the only answer that you had that was seeing regular play.
Right.
And that's where you mentioned about, Ruby Amethyst decks having 20 ink in play, because you would literally go like Elsa, Aladdin, Pocket Watch all in one turn to do all this all in one turn, or else you're not moving the game forward.
Right. Elsa, Aladdin, Pocket Watch, Shield, like
right.
just
right. Do all this stuff in one turn, and then
Right.
and then basically your board is safe and theirs is taken care of. So Elsa is powerful, but she became even more powerful when you think about it esoterically, because she was the only person that could actually do this.
Right.
So the only way that your Aladdin actually could interact with your opponent's board, if they wanted you to, was through Elsa. Or the only way that, and I hadn't seen, Amethyst Amber decks, but you can again make the same argument with mid-range Rapunzels and things like that as well. Elsa could be the top end, swing your guy in, and then eventually you play a Rapunzel. Yeah. I did see a couple people playing Poison Apple for a similar effect to either there weren't a lot, not necessarily taking out a bunch of princesses, but literally just to be able to exert a character. And have the item sit and play. It's easier to basically spend 3 ink and have it sit and play and eventually spend 1 than it would be to use it later. I think if the chapter 1 metagame had another 2 months,
right,
I think we'd probably reach a point, honestly, where we would see more of these cards become staples, because you would need them to have more interaction on the board.
Right, and we also we already had seen just like less cards being played that were quote staples early on. Like, you had mentioned like the Rafiki had just fallen out. Like at first it was like, yep, got to play 2, 3, 4 Rafikis to playing 0. Same thing with like a Zeus, right? Like Zeus is not a great example. It was never really high end favored, but it was being seen played. And it's crazy to me to think that like, yeah, we did see Poison Apples in decks in top 8s of various events all over. But yeah, it is interesting to figure out if we did have another month, if we did have like another 6 weeks or something like that, would we get to a point that we could truly adapt to it even further with a limited card pool? Because in all honesty, like those 3 cards are the top end. Like Refreeze is not a good card.
Right.
Anna is not even useful because you have to have Elsa in play to even make her worth anything. So it's like there just isn't a lot of answers. And then as we already said, because of the way it all went out, Ruby Amethyst had more trouble than just Rapunzel. So, it is what it is, right? But let's talk about the adaptation. So the adaptation is that in Rise of the Floodborn, we have much different ways to interact, but these are still the cards that are creating this similar effect. So let's walk through these ones, Scott.
So the cards on screen are ones that I see falling into the same trap. So let's start with the healing cards, for example, or the removing damage cards. So your Grandpappies and your Rapunzel's Gifted Artists. They need, again, damage characters to be in play pretty regularly in order to use their effect. That 5-cost Rapunzel, I mean, compared to her 4-cost self, is a lot worse when you cannot constantly be removing damage from a constant stream of damage characters. And Grandpappy's the same way. I mean, can you Grandpappy bomb like on turn like 7 or 8 and like, have a bunch of remove damage effects already in play and then hopefully, get damage off your guys? Not if they don't have any damage on them. So if your opponent is expecting that play, like if you like, I don't know, like if you be our guest, the Grandpappy or something like that, or they just absolutely know what you're playing in games 2 or 3 or something like that, it's going to be the same exact problem. There's no damage to remove if there's no interaction with your characters. Last Stand is an example. If you can't banish your character, I mean, if you can't challenge a character, you can't even use this card. Like, there's no banish. You can't banish a character that was challenged if there's no one to challenge.
Right.
Dinner Bell is exactly the same problem as the remove damage. If there's no damage on characters because they can't challenge anybody, there's no damage that you can count up in order to draw that many cards. So Dinner Bell is exactly the same problem as the quote healing deck. Shere Khan is, again, if there's no one to challenge, you're not gaining any incremental lore. It doesn't make him a bad card. He's still a 3/3/1 for 3. He's still an on-curve character, but his huge value goes down if there's no one to challenge. The last card might seem a little strange that I have on here in Christopher Robin, but he needs to be exerted in order to be ready. So if there's no one to challenge and all you can do is quest, decks that are built around him to want to constantly be readying challenge, readying sing, readying whatever, you need to have characters on the other side of the board to be able to challenge them in order for him to ready multiple times in a turn. So for him as an engine, to me, it's very similar to Rapunzel or Grandpappy or Shere Khan. Like, you have to have characters on the other side of the board that are exerted in order to interact with, in order to make him powerful.
Yeah. And I think that's the interesting thing about all this is that they're two-folded answers here, right? Now, I think aside from the Rapunzel, like the Christopher Robin, the Grandpappy, and the Shere Khan they're all implemented of paying off in a way for exerting, for damaging. But it's the same thing where it's like, yeah, there's these alternate ways to gain lore now, which is going to help decrease game time, hopefully. But it's still turning into that effect of like, well, if I know what my opponent's plan is, how do I disrupt it? And that's kind of the key factor here of all of chapter 1 is there was a lot of like, I can't give my opponent Rapunzel value, or I can't make my opponent's Maui good. Like, I can't make Rafiki good. Like, how do I change my lines of play to make it make any sense? And I think that's the big takeaway here is that these cards, the 3 cards I named, specifically move the game forward as an actual clock rather than card advantage. So that's why I think that, like, hopefully they do more for the game than like the Rapunzels of the world did. Obviously, Aladdin is in that same aspect, but Aladdin was the biggest. The problem with all these cards is this is the same thing. Is like everyone was afraid of Aladdin, and they're going to be afraid to let you get the most out of these cards as well. So because of that, let's discuss what cards are actually being implemented that kind of help us get around this. So we have Cinderella and Pick a Fight. And then Teeth and Ambitions, Ratigan, and Pinocchio. Now, these are the good thing about this, right? Is that this is 3 different inks worth of color, worth of cards. So it's not like it's all just invested in the same ink, which I do like and enjoy. But what about these cards do you think is going to quote fix the problem?
So the steel ones are the obvious answer, and that Princess Tatiana or whatever she wasn't revealed at the time that I put this together. But I mean, Cinderella is an obvious answer because she can challenge ready characters when you sing a song. So like it doesn't even matter if your opponent's characters are exerted or not. That's what makes her very powerful. And if there's none of them in play, she can still quest for 3 lore. So she's a huge threat no matter how you slice it, and can come out as early as turn 4 or 5, especially if Lantern's in play and you have a smaller Cinderella in play as well. She also has resist 2, which means when she is challenging those characters, she's probably going to win that combat. So she's a threat in all aspects of the game, which is exactly what you want to see. You want to see a character that if your opponent's not giving you any options, she's still able to be a threat. That 3 lore that she has on her is specifically different than other characters even like Hades and Big Maleficent Dragon. Like, yes, they deal with a character when they come into play, but they only have 2 lore.
Right.
Her 3 lore makes her a much bigger threat in that mid to late game. Her ability is of the Singing Sword is basically copied on Pick a Fight. This is, obviously I wish this card was inkable, but as an uninkable, this gives you basically the Cinderella ability on any character. Again, it's an engine starter. If you can swing any character into somebody else that they're not allowing you to challenge because they're staying ready, this will allow you to enable your Rapunzel. Like, play this and Rapunzel on turn 6, you're getting value.
Yeah.
So this allows you to make up for some of those deficiencies. So I do think Pick a Fight will often see play as a 2 to 3 of in most decks to get around this problem if it continues. Teeth and Ambition is a great card. Like, I'm so glad that this card exists because this does exactly what you want it to do. It puts damage on your characters while damaging their characters and is a song. So you're exerting one of your characters, giving them the ability to be challenged and damaging probably somebody else, maybe the same character, etc., and being able to damage your opponent's characters at the same time. So you're hurting their board while helping your board at the same time. So this is a very good card to make up for this Rapunzel problem that we've been talking about. Ratigan is another issue. He allows you to exert characters on your opponent's side of the board to allow them to be challenged, and Ready's one of your own characters. So again, like, this is everything you want all in one card, making one of their characters available to be challenged while you are on ready one of yours to be able to challenge it. The last card, which I think probably isn't getting a lot of hype, is that two-drop Pinocchio, which basically has the freeze ability on it, which it's basically just freeze on a 1/1/1 body, same cost, same uninkability. But I think for low to the ground Amethyst decks, it's going to be a necessary evil to play this card again, just so you have that ability to interact with your opponent's board. So you're not just sitting there waiting for, alpha strikes to build up and questing all at once. So I do think that Pinocchio will also see play in various decks as a necessary evil.
Yeah. And the great thing about these cards is that aside from the last two, right? I think like the Ratigan and the Pinocchio are like the fringe, mostly because they're uninkable. And like in those colors, it might be hard, but like Ratigan just might turn into being like, Dragon's Fire is really good. It's always gonna be very good, but like even by the end, like you weren't necessarily always playing 4 Dragon Fires. Ratigan might be good in certain synergies. Like, so you might end up playing Ratigan over Dragonfire in some situations just because you're like, well, I get the most out of this untap, along with being able to tap down an opposing character and things like that. The Pinocchio, I think, is a very interesting one just because it's like you said, I don't think anyone's really talking about that card. I think it's under the radar. I think Freeze is like a really bad card. So, like Freeze is just a bad card, right? I just keep going back to it. But the Pinocchio being a character still embodies some of the things that we want. We can still utilize him for every other things. If he was inkable, it would probably be a slam dunk inclusion in most decks.
Agreed.
The uninkables might hinder him a bit, but I definitely think he's like a starting, like he's worth trying. Like, like I think you could definitely be like, all right, let me play 10 games with this guy and see if it does matter. Hard to say. The other three, though, right? Like Cinderella to me, she embodies all of it. She really does. Like, she's just like I am not going to allow for these things to happen. And with all the additional facts of, being able to have shift and rush, the way the songs work in general with exerting characters to like the exerting characters themselves are opening up to things that they're still making you play into the board and things like that. They're still creating these other moments where it's like, you have to do this to move the game forward. And I think that's the whole point about like this entire podcast is like moving the game forward is something that needs to happen more often. And we don't want those stall effects to continue running rampant, right? Like, and it like, that's the crazy thing here is that in chapter 1, we saw so much of this where it's just like, how do I move the game forward? And now in chapter 2, we see like 5 cards, if not more, right? There's still 50-ish cards that have to be revealed that you might even see more of these and hopefully in other inks that help interact with the board. So with that, Scott, what are our closing thoughts on the Rapunzel effect?
It's a thing that smart players realized. So I think early on in any meta games, you're going to gravitate towards this. On paper seems like a very powerful effect, and not necessarily think about the fact that you may not be able to activate it.
Right.
Like if you look at a lot of the cards, like Grandpappy or Shuriken and things like that, like it seems like on paper you're always going to have targets, you're always going to have the ability to use these cards. So if I slant my deck towards making the maximum use out of this, I'll have a deck. The problem is you need an opponent that's going to allow you to do that.
Right.
And smart opponents won't allow you to do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that you need to build your decks and think about ways, what happens if everything doesn't go right for me?
Right.
And early on in chapter 1 was like, oh, what if I don't have enough ink? Well, we're past that point. Now it's like, what if I don't have enough interaction? And that's where I think, you know, I like the fact that these type of conversations and these type of situations are going to come up. But you just need to build your deck and play the game, understanding what those interactions could be.
Right. And like the key sum here is you need to get the most out of your cards. You also have to understand what your opponent's going to do to like take that luxury away from you.
Yep.
And I think that's going to be a key factor in building or very early on in Rise of the Floodborn.
Yep. Agreed.
But with that, guys, hope you guys enjoyed this kind of like TED talk on interactions in the game. Basically, that's what it was. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you haven't yet, hit the like button, hit that subscribe for me, and we'll catch you in the next video.
See ya.